I was saying something about anti-discrimination law. I got cut off for some reason. So that's what she's dealing with, anti-discrimination law, as this applies in particular here to sex and to race, but specifically to the experience of certain groups of black women, thinking about the kind of discrimination they felt they had experienced precisely as black women. And she looks at three court cases that were brought forward along these sorts of lines, and basically wants to show that the inability, basically, of the law as it stood at the time, basically, owing to how it was just understood, its actual kind of conceptual structure just somehow ruled out properly coming to terms with what was going on in these cases. There was GM, and there was a helicopter company and a pharmaceutical company, basically. Now, they're all different cases, but she's trying to bring out her main points. Now, there's two related points, closely related. One is she thinks that discrimination law has always been kind of conceived on the basis of a relatively privileged group. The discrimination on the basis of sex has been understood from the perspective, she thinks, of white women. She thinks that discrimination on the basis of race has been understood from the perspective of black men. And this, she thinks, leaves black women in a precarious kind of position when it comes to trying to bring their own cases of discrimination to the courts and to find redress for these, basically. So the related point, and the main way that her critique is probably best expressed, is that discrimination is always understood, or oppression, we could say, is always understood in single axis terms. There's other ways we could express that, but the idea that oppression comes in sort of discrete forms. There is sex discrimination, there is race discrimination, there are other forms of discrimination, and they're all relatively discrete, basically, and can be understood in their own terms. And she thinks, well, this is part of the basic problem in terms of understanding what's going on in the situations that she's concerned with, right? She basically wants to say that it's basically a simplifying abstraction to see these things in these terms, that it's not the case that in situations, for example, of black women, that it's simply the additive effect of this plus that, of discrimination or oppression on the basis of sex, plus on the basis of race and perhaps other things as well, that just doesn't quite add up right. It doesn't add up to the actual concrete reality that they've experienced. This then gets reflected in the way the course simply failed, for the most part, in her view, to properly comprehend and come to terms and find a solution to the forms of discrimination that they brought forward. So that's really her main point, basically. And there's a lot to think about in that, right? That to understand oppression in general, right? Because that's really what she's interested in. It's a general understanding, not only something that applies to black women or others, right? She thinks, well, the best way to do that is to start there, right? That we go wrong and we go in the wrong direction and we don't get very good results, and we start more or less at the top, kind of looking down from positions of relative privilege, because then it could seem that additive model perhaps makes sense. Whereas if you approach things initially from the standpoint, which is a word we'll use a lot later on, of those who are multiply oppressed in different ways, then you get a much more accurate, a more concrete, a more comprehensive understanding. Do pay attention to that basement analogy. So you've got a couple of metaphors in there. One is of a basement. I think it's on page 151 onto the next page or so. Basically to say you don't get the best view of what's really going on from the perspective of who's at the top of the basement, let alone those who are on the main floor looking down, but from those further down, basically. And that in those terms, we can come up with a more encompassing, a more comprehensive understanding of oppression in general, which would apply to those who, perhaps fortunately for them, are not multiply oppressed. But in fact, that's how we're going to do the best job. This is going to be the way that the sort of the problems we were dealing with in terms of exclusion and the limitations that feminism faced can be best addressed. That's kind of the main point, basically, for now from Crenshaw.